Hello, and welcome to Mrs. Brodowski's Character Lecture for English 1. Characters are people in a story, but they could also be animals or plants or sometimes other things. I like to think about characters in real life too, and how people can be read just like books. Identity answers the questions, who am I and who are you? Characters in a book have identities just as much as anybody around us does. And if we have some skills to understand people's identities, we can often understand what motivates them in different situations. I like to say that we are all pies. Identity has many different pieces, including race, religion, age, and many other components. These pieces can work together to make someone have privileges in their life, but also they can work against them and cause oppressions. This happens with characters and with people. The different parts of a person or character's identity can overlap to create privileges for them and make life easier, or oppressions. Societies and government and other characters can make it hard for a person based upon what their identity is. Intersectionality is just a fancy word for the overlap of those different parts of identity. In literature, the protagonist is the main character, and that character's problem drives the story. Usually they're a good guy that we like, but sometimes you have a protagonist you don't like, and that makes for a really interesting reading experience. An antagonist is any force working against the protagonist. We oftentimes think of this as an enemy or another character, but this can also be society, it could be nature. There's lots of ways for the book to create conflict and have something working against the main character in the story. Whenever a character has an internal conflict, they're dealing with something inside their own mind, emotions, or heart that causes problems for them. This happens in real life, and sometimes people outside of the main character, the protagonist, or the person don't actually know what's going on. This is the person versus themselves. An external conflict is when a character or a person is struggling against the outside world. This might mean that you're fighting against the government or society or poverty or some force like that, but also it can actually be a physical fight against nature. We can read people, we can read stories, and we can read ourselves. The process of understanding a person or a character is called characterization. When we learn about a character in a book directly from the black and white text in the story, that's called direct characterization. Maybe the narrator tells us what's going on, or a character or a different character, but we find out right from the text, and it's pretty easy to tell what's happening with a particular character. Indirect characterization is when we have to read between the lines and infer about what a character thinks or feels. This happens all the time when someone asks you, "How are you doing?" and you say, "I'm fine," but you don't really mean it. They have to think about it, listen to your tone, and figure out what you really mean and how you're really doing. There's a handy acronym called STEAL that helps us understand people. It works in books just like regular folks. So if you think about what somebody is saying, what they're thinking, how they're acting toward others, their actions and what they look like, you can get a decent but not perfect picture of who they are. You can characterize them. As we understand people and characters, we need to be careful not to stereotype. We don't want to have an overly simplified view of a person based on a group that we think they belong to. People may not want to share particular parts of their identities, and we need to know that even if we think we understand a person 100%, we don't, because we're not them. A dynamic character changes in the story, and they change in a fundamental way. So by the end of the story, they're quite a bit different than they were at the beginning. A static character in the story does not change. They stay exactly the same. That normally happens with characters who are not as important as the protagonist, but every now and again you get a protagonist who doesn't change, and that might be their actual conflict in life. We have to be careful as readers of people and readers of books to make sure that we are aware of our own bias. A bias is a distorted view, often based upon what we assume about someone. So it's better to ask people directly, or to listen, or to read as closely as possible to keep our assumptions at a minimum. But bias is a natural part of life, and we all do it. The main lesson to take away from the process of reading people and reading books is empathy. That's the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And we know that you'll never be the other person, but it's really important skill that we can begin to think about life from someone else's perspective, however incomplete that is. Thanks for listening and have a great day.